On the 25th of October 2022, Dr. Dewi Evans gave evidence for the first time in the trial of Lucy Letby. In an ironic foreshadowing of this process, the Chester Standard reporting for the day describes Dr. Evans as someone who was a consultant paediatrician at the time of June 2015, thereby ironically giving incorrect information. Dr. Evans gave evidence in court in relation to Child A and Child B on Tuesday the 25th of October. But in this video we're going to examine comments that he made when cross-examined by Ben Myers ahead of discussing those infants. So the cross-examination of Dr. Evans begins at 2:10 in the afternoon. It should be noted that he'd already had some discussion with the prosecuting barrister Nick Johnson, but here we're going to focus on his cross-examination by Ben Myers. We may look at the discussion with Johnson at some point in the future. So it begins with Ben Myers speaking. Dr. Evans, at the point we're at now, you've been provided with all the exhibits relating to the medical evidence of the children in this trial, haven't you? Yes. And so far as we know, you've had access to all the witness statements dealing with the medical aspects of the case. As far as I know, yes. As far as you know. And as the trial has been proceeding in front of the jury, you've been able to watch it, albeit from another courtroom on the link. Yes. So you've been able to follow what has been happening. Yes. Your involvement in this investigation began in 2017, did it? It did. And it's continued over the years since then, hasn't it? Yes. At the moment you're giving evidence about babies A and B. Yes. And also some of the general issues relating to air embolus. Yes. You've prepared and provided a very large number of reports, inevitably over the years, haven't you? Yes. And what you say about air embolus generally features across dozens of them, doesn't it? Well, a number of them, yes. Yes, a number of them then, however you like to put it. Well, dozens is 24 plus. It could well be dozens actually, given the children you have looked at. The reports have covered particular children where it has been an issue in your view, haven't they? Yes. And they have also covered reports which have dealt with specific aspects of air embolus, haven't they? Yes. I was just checking that you mean literally, not a figure of speech. No, literally dozens, my lord, but I'm grateful for checking that. It wasn't a figure of speech. With that in mind, could you tell us, what do you say are the features that support a diagnosis of air embolus? Sorry, can you say that again? What? What are the features? Oh, right. The characteristic to support a diagnosis of air embolus. Right. The first is that it occurs in a patient of any age where there is access to the circulation via an external line. In other words, an intravenous cannula. So there has to be some kind of access there firstly. The second point, and the most important point, is that an air embolus will lead to a sudden and unexpected collapse. That's actually important in some of the later cases where we know that the speed of collapse was not consistent with what's just been stated here. However, we're not going to examine that today. This initial portion, I will mention as well, is just setting up the important questioning that is to follow. A patient otherwise stable, irrespective of age, otherwise stable, suddenly collapses, and by collapse I mean stopping breathing, change of colour, cyanosis and bradycardia, in other words reduced heart rate and death, and this occurs all of a sudden. There are additional features, and as with all of clinical medicine, you don't get all of these features in all of the cases. And as we've heard this week and last, the two major associated features are those of unusual skin discoloration. Before we go further, I'll just mention, I'm not sure that it's true to state that you don't get all of the features in all of clinical medicine. So the implication there is that any diagnosis that is made, you don't get all of the diagnostic features or symptoms. That is certainly what he's implying anyway. I'm pretty sure that's untrue. So he goes on to say, and I won't elaborate on that because I think we've explained that, and also the presence of air in the great vessels or air in various parts of the body. It could be the heart, could be the vein, could be the aorta. So those are the compounding features that lead to a diagnosis of air embolus. The other point, which is also important from a clinical point of view, is that this collapse occurs not only out of the blue, but there is no other explanation that fits with the diagnosis of collapse. The final point is that, and this applies obviously to patients in hospital, is that resuscitation is unsuccessful. So before we continue with this, let's just look at those two previous points. So we've already dealt with the idea that the collapse occurs out of the blue. So the more we look at the panel's information, the more it becomes clear that these collapses did not occur out of the blue. And also there are cases in which Dr. Evans has made a so-called diagnosis of air embolism, or the injection of air, in which the collapse has taken a considerable period of time. It's simply not consistent with his so-called diagnosis. The second thing is, he has made this comment about there is no other explanation that fits with the diagnosis of collapse. That's an important point that we're going to return to as this video continues. And then the third thing is that he's made this comment about resuscitation being unsuccessful. That's another important point that we're going to return to as we continue. Because of the way doctors are trained, resuscitating patients is part of our bread and butter, so the procedures that we use to resuscitate babies, children, adults are well known, well drilled into us. But when the resuscitation does not work, leading to the death of your patient, then that adds to one's confirmation of the diagnosis of air embolism. So I would say that last statement is one that is completely without foundation. I don't think that you can realistically say that a failed resuscitation is a meaningful confirmation of the diagnosis of air embolism. But it's important to note that what he's saying here is that the resuscitation isn't key in his so-called diagnosis. As I've said before, there are no diagnoses in this court case. These are just theories and hypotheses that he's dragged out of the ether, essentially. There's nothing that even comes close to being a diagnosis, but that will be crystal clear by the end of this video. So when he's talking about resuscitation here, he's saying, oh, it's just something that adds to the confirmation. So he's saying, you've already made a diagnosis of air embolism, but then when the resuscitation does not work, that just adds to something that you already believe. So that's an important point as we continue this discussion. So then Ben Meyer says, thank you. Just in terms of your position with it, can I ask, when did you last see a case of air embolus in clinical practice? In my 30 years as a consultant paediatrician in Swansea, we had no cases of air embolus in the neonatal unit, and we had no cases of air embolus with which I was involved in the neonatal unit or anywhere else. In relation to, which is something I'm pretty proud of, by the way. In relation to Swansea generally, one of the great tragedies that occurred to us in Swansea is a baby who suffered an air embolus as a complication of what should have been a routine surgical procedure. This was a baby of a few weeks old who was having an operation for a condition called pyloric stenosis. Part of the surgical procedure is making a nick in the lower aspect of the stomach without actually causing a perforation. What the surgeon does is ask the anaesthetist to inject air into the stomach to ensure there is no leak. It's routine. For one reason or another, instead of injecting air both into the stomach, I'm not entirely sure what that's supposed to say, it's a typo, he attached the syringe to the intravenous line, injected air into the circulation, the poor baby collapsed there and then, and resuscitation was unsuccessful, and the baby died. As you can imagine, this was absolutely awful. It was haunting, it led to a trial, a criminal trial, etc. So what I would say with regard to this is that Dr. Evans states here that this is an accidental incident that has occurred on the unit. So in his brilliant theory of air embolism, or diagnosis as he describes it, he never explains why air that was present in the infants couldn't have been present accidentally, which it can be, which it was in a study that was presented by Professor Owen Arthurs in court, in which he found that a very significant percentage, not the majority, but a large minority of infants have air present in these vessels. And of course, these infants didn't die. There's no question of any malfeasance with any of these infants. So it's clear that air can be present accidentally. Dr. Evans is giving an indication of an incident here in which air was present accidentally, but he never gave any meaningful mechanism for how he ruled out the accidental introduction of air. And so it continues. And I think it's something that, despite not having anything to do with this particular baby, is something that you never ever forget, understandably. So that's the closest I've got to a baby with an air embolus. It is that rare and unusual. In fact, that's something you refer to in one of your general reports, isn't it? Yes. You refer to it in It's Awful, a report of 3rd of June 2019. For those who are keeping a note, if it's relevant, it's page 475 of the statement. And in that case, the baby collapsed very quickly. Is that correct? Again, I have not seen the report, but yes, yes. And resuscitation was not successful, and the baby died, yes. As it happens, there's certainly nothing you put in your report on that occasion, Dr. Evans, suggesting there was any kind of discoloration that you have identified that was linked to that. I have not seen the report, I've not been involved in any way with this case, all I know is it happened. So we'll just pause at this point. So obviously what Ben Myers is doing here is saying Dr. Evans has never encountered this before, and he's therefore not reliant on clinical experience, he's entirely reliant on a literature review. While this is a perfectly valid point, and it's a point that I've made in my book, and it's a point that is also made in the Court of Appeal verdict, I should say in mitigation that doing a literature review is perfectly legitimate. Doing a case note review is perfectly legitimate. If you're qualified, and if you're knowledgeable, and if you do what is a very delicate process, it was described to me by a vascular surgeon, a case note review, as being a very delicate and skilled process. So I'll leave viewers to decide whether Dr. Evans would have the kind of delicacy and skill required to do an excellent case note review or not. But it is something that is not easy to do. However, it is legitimate to diagnose conditions via case notes and via literature reviews if you do it correctly. It is definitely an advantage to have clinical experience, but it's not entirely necessary. Nonetheless, this is a legitimate line of questioning, but I just do want to be clear in the interest of balance, because we're going to be quite critical of Dr. Evans as this video continues, but I want to be clear in the interest of balance that it is reasonable to diagnose something from a literature review and from case notes. That's not entirely unreasonable. So anyway, the discussion continues. You're unaware of any discoloration or indication. I have no idea. So in terms of your clinical experience, there's no what could be said to be hands-on experience of diagnosing object encountering air embolus, is there, or how it presents? Absolutely not, and I think that's something I'm very relieved and pleased about, actually. We understand that, but in terms of how you're describing what you see in this case, you're not comparing that against any clinical personal experience, are you? Good heavens, no. In reaching conclusions about embolus in this case, would it be right to say that to some extent you've relied upon what could be called a diagnosis of exclusion? Yes. And a diagnosis of exclusion is where a clinician looks at what he or she considers to be the available alternatives. Yes. And having discounted those that appear to be available, is then left with one or two options, maybe just one, and so in that way they reach a diagnosis in that route. Yes. And that's a diagnosis of exclusion. In this particular case, there is more to it than a diagnosis of exclusion because we know about the discoloration. I'm happy to discuss that with you, and we know about Dr. Arthur's reports about air in the great vessels. So therefore, in this, when I formed my initial diagnosis because I had reached the conclusion, I reached a diagnosis of air embolus without knowing about the discoloration, and we're talking about baby A. So what you will see in the remainder of this conversation on several occasions is this kind of disjointed speaking where Dr. Evans stumbles over his words. At this point in time, I'm not going to make any suggestions regarding that. I just want you to observe that as we continue. In fact, I'm talking generally at the moment. I will be coming to baby A. So in general, it's a diagnosis of exclusion, but if you then discover additional items of information, discoloration is one, air on X-ray is another, and as Dr. Owen Arthur said, you don't need abnormal X-rays to confirm the diagnosis. So that just simply firms up your diagnosis. Alright, so you're able to proceed, no hands-on experience. I'm just pointing that out. You're not comparing it with anything, but you're able to proceed by way of a diagnosis of exclusion, and you can look for supporting features where they exist. You've also sought to rely upon research into this area where it's available, haven't you? Right, it is quite important to say that yes, part of clinical procedure is a term we heard last week, evidence-based medicine. So we're going to continue to discuss that in a second, but I just want to stop here and look at this diagnosis of exclusion. So a diagnosis of exclusion, of course, should exclude all reasonable possibilities so that you're left with one diagnosis. So here in this answer, where Dr. Evans says, in general, it's a diagnosis of exclusion. So if you then discover additional items of information, discoloration is one, air on X-ray is another, And as Dr. Owen Arthur said, you don't need abnormal x-rays to confirm the diagnosis. That just simply firms up your diagnosis. So what Dr. Evans is saying here is that he had decided on her embolism before he heard about discoloration, before he had the error on the x-ray, before he basically had anything at all. So again, we're going to discuss this further as this video continues. But I just want to be clear on that, because earlier on he said that he knew about the diagnosis and that he'd decide on the diagnosis before he saw discoloration, and that just firmed it up. And essentially he's saying that again here. He's just saying discoloration confirms the diagnosis. So we'll come back to that later in this video. So he's mentioned this comment about evidence-based medicine. And then Ben Meyer says to him, yes, I asked Dr. Owen Arthurs about this, or Professor Owen Arthurs. So here he's going on about evidence-based medicine. Now this has almost no relevance to anything that occurs from here on in, but I will read this out anyway. Evidence-based medicine basically has 4 tiers. One's own experience is one. Higher up is what you read in textbooks, and higher up still is what you read in medical peer-reviewed journals. The problem with air embolus is that you have to rely firstly on, well, very often on isolated case reports, one case here, one case there. You have to rely on the fact that medical teams are honest enough to disclose that a child under their care died of air embolus, because one tends not to spread news about the mistakes we make. And most important another important point there. And most important of all, I think, in this, with regard to air embolus, as I said this morning, the paper we refer to most commonly is the one by Lee and Tanswell, 1989. Who could possibly have anticipated that this would become so significant? There are very little new publications, I'm assuming he means very few new publications, regarding air embolus in babies. That is not a criticism, that's a compliment. Well, it's not really a compliment. It's not a compliment to say that there haven't been any publications in the last 30 years, but still. You can't produce research papers or publish papers on conditions that don't occur. And we've become obsessive, meticulous throughout our careers in relation to avoiding getting air into the circulation of sick babies and sick children. So I'm sure that's true. I'm not for one second suggesting that's not true. But please be aware, and let me remind you, that there was air present in over 1/3, approximately 40% of infants that were surveyed in this study that was performed by Professor Owen Arthurs, that was presented in court, that is referenced in the Court of Appeal judgment. So it's not as rare. Dr. Evans is suggesting here there's never any air in the circulation of a sick baby or a child or a neonate or a premature baby. That's not true. So it's not a matter of having to apologise for quoting research papers that are 30 years old or more, nor is a weakness, I believe, in quoting papers that involve just one case, for instance. One of the papers I published, he means one of the papers I used, was from Pakistan, I think, where they don't do post-mortems. So therefore, the assistance that we get in the situation of this nature from research papers is inevitably relatively limited. So in the Court of Appeal judgment, it explains the way that Dr. Evans diagnosed embolism. So we'll just go over that very quickly. So this is paragraph 40 in the Court of Appeal judgment. I'm going to particularly highlight the blue text here, or the text that's highlighted in blue, but I'll read the whole paragraph. Dr. Evans produced his review of published literature regarding air embolus in a newborn infant in July 2019, by which time he had provided over 40 reports for the police investigation. Of course, if we could get our hands on Dr. Evans' so-called review of published literature regarding air embolus in a newborn infant, and if that could be put in front of medical professionals and scientists, then we would find out very quickly that that report has no merit whatsoever. Unfortunately, the police are trying to hold on to those reports. This should be in the public domain by now almost. So ridiculous is this case, and so ridiculous is what this guy has put in the court case. However, we don't have that document, so we can't tear it to shreds as we would be able to if we had it in front of us. The impetus for this work was his growing concern that the causes of the collapses and deaths of several of the babies at the unit had been the intentional introduction of air in the baby's circulation. And here is the key part of this paragraph. The document reviewed 18 studies or case reports drawn from the world literature where death had been attributed to air embolus. Let me read that to you again. The document reviewed 18 studies or case reports drawn from the world literature where death had been attributed to air embolus. So when Dr. Evans says, I used 18 papers, all of the other so-called studies are, as is described here, case reports in which there's information given about a case in which, as it says here, death has been attributed to air embolus, and then Dr. Evans just looked at the conditions and said, we'll attribute that to this case, we'll attribute that to that case. None of these papers were used diagnostically. The only paper that was used diagnostically was Lee and Tanswell. Dr. Evans has just confirmed that with his words in the court case, and this here confirms it again. He observed that the individual cases reported in the various papers demonstrated features similar to those observed by the members of clinical staff called to resuscitate the infants at the unit. So when Dr. Evans makes these claims about 18 studies, we can put that to bed immediately because of what is written in the Court of Appeal. Of course, we could do that by looking at the studies themselves individually as well, but this is a very easy way of doing it. It should also be noted briefly that Dr. Evans claims to have read the entire Court of Appeal verdict, and he has on more than one occasion praised the Court of Appeal for rubber stamping his work, or endorsing his work, I should say. So he can't claim that he didn't know this had been written. So when he makes these claims about I used 18 papers, he used one paper diagnostically. He has just confirmed that anyway. So we shouldn't even have to do this, but I'm just doing this just to demonstrate that it was stated in the Court of Appeal judgment that he has read, that he claimed is a wonderful thing. And yet it reveals quite clearly that this claim that he's made is, to be incredibly generous, disingenuous. I'd say it's just outright untrue. So then we'll return to Ben Myers. What I just wanted to establish was that research papers play a part in what you do, and they do, don't they? It does. Before I move on, I just want to ask you about one thing you said. You said we don't spread news about the mistakes we make. Who is the we when you said we don't spread news about the mistakes we make? I think it's a royal we, it's a royal we. Well, we is who? It's a royal medical we. You know, it's human nature, I think, to share information with your nearest and dearest as far as your medical colleagues are concerned. You refer to the coroner, as has happened in many cases here. So you deal with it in that way, and you have to run it past the health board, the health trust. But it's not something that you publish in the press, public press and media. Alright, so is it fair to say that people might be a little slow to acknowledge where they've made mistakes? Yes, absolutely. So I'm sure you see the significance of this portion of the discussion. Of course, we know there were many mistakes on this unit. Now, when you consider a case that comes before you and there's been a serious deterioration or a death, I was going to suggest to you there's a number of options or conclusions you can draw. These are just initial points. We will get to the detail of everything in a little bit, Dr. Evans. Where there is a serious deterioration or a death, that may be due to an identified medical condition. That's one option, isn't it? That's correct, yes. I'm suggesting these are all things that you must keep in mind when you're in the position that you're in, yes. They may be due to a medical condition that is currently known but hasn't actually been identified in the proceedings if the investigation is associated with them. Well, if it's not been identified, it can't be known. You know, Dr. Evans, there is space sometimes for uncertainty in medical diagnosis, isn't there? Yes, that's a different point altogether. Now remember, Dr. Evans has said that since this court case was over, he said there should never be an uncertain death. There should never be a cause of death. A death should never occur, and there shouldn't be an explicit cause of death identified. According to Dr. Evans, that should never happen. This is something that he has said explicitly since the court case was continued. So just another very dubious statement that he's made in an attempt to defend himself since this court case was concluded. Well, is it the case that there may be a situation that it's due to a medical condition that is known but not identified, such as, well, for example, a genetic condition? Tell us about the genetic testing in this case, or metabolic testing. Genetic conditions causing air embolus, okay. No, you asked me. I'm answering your question, has there been genetic metabolic testing in this case? As far as I know, no. No, right. But I'm unaware of any genetic, for what it's worth, I'm unaware of any genetic condition that would lead to. So it's important to keep in mind a medical condition that is currently known may be currently unidentified. It happens, yes. Sometimes you have to keep in mind it may be due to a medical condition that is currently unknown. Sometimes. Well, these are hypotheticals, aren't they? Yes, they are. There may be a problem in care given that has played a part in what takes place in the care that has been given or treatment. Yes, that's a possibility. That might be difficult to identify if people are slow to spread news about it, mightn't it? No, it would be difficult to identify if a patient presents with in a way they have never seen before. It may be due to deliberate inflicted harm, of course, absolutely. Sometimes the right outcome is to consider that ultimately it cannot be ascertained from the available evidence. It is unascertained. That is a term I'm familiar with, yes. Well, you've been appearing as an expert witness before the courts for many years, haven't you, Dr. Evans? I have. And you are familiar with that pathologists, for example, will find the cause of death unascertained. That is true. Indeed, you surely will have had reports where you have found the explanation is unascertained. That is correct. So that's always a possibility, isn't it? Yes, it is. I'm just looking at the range of where you can get to when you look at a situation. Do you understand? Yes. Would you agree it's important not to focus disproportionately upon a conclusion of deliberate harm if there's no direct evidence of it? Would it? Can you say that again? I'll rephrase it. It's important not to hurry to a conclusion of deliberate harm if there's no direct evidence. Would you agree? You never hurry to a diagnosis that has such serious consequences. So let's just pause at that point. So you never hurry to a diagnosis that has such serious consequences. So we know what Dr. Evans said in the BBC Panorama programme. It's nothing that he hasn't said before. Previously, he stated that he walked into the police station and decided that there was deliberate harm within 10 minutes. In the Panorama programme, he seemed to shorten that period to a matter of a few minutes. So here he is in court saying you should never rush into making a diagnosis with serious consequences, ever. And yet, in the police station, he was able to decide within a matter of minutes that there was definitely inflicted harm. Now, I suppose what he would claim is that that is not a diagnosis. But as soon as the police hear that, and obviously you're travelling there from the National Crime Agency to the Cheshire Police Station to meet with the Cheshire Constabulary, of course, as he will indicate himself later in this discussion, you pretty much know that a crime is suspected. You should be very careful about what you're saying according to your own words, Dr. Evans. And so what did he do, according to his own words? He said almost immediately, and indeed he used this phrase himself, of almost immediately, he decided almost immediately that there had definitely been inflicted harm. Now, I would not unreasonably ask the question, how had he managed to exclude all possible accidental explanations for what he was observing in that period of time? That matter of minutes, a few minutes, to use his words. I would suggest to you that is impossible. And I would suggest that what he did was, again, to be as generous as possible, to give the most generous interpretation that we possibly can, that was phenomenally irresponsible. So we'll continue with the cross-examination. And would you agree that the fact there is an allegation of deliberate harm should not be the starting point when you approach a clinical pathological situation to form an opinion? Absolutely. When you were asked to review the cases and asked for your involvement in this investigation, you told us that the NCA were the agency that contacted you. That's the National Crime Agency. Yes. Did they provide you with the theory that deliberate harm had been done? No. By the time that I had the NCA got me involved in this case, I had prepared nearly 50 reports for police authorities on other issues on top of all my other stuff with the family court, etc. So therefore, I was someone who was known to them as someone who has dealt with, with suspicious events. Clearly the fact that the police were involved, let's just go over this slowly. Clearly the fact that the police were involved, I would have to be a bit naive not to appreciate that somebody was concerned about what was going on. So let's read that again. Clearly the fact that the police were involved, I would have to be a bit naive not to appreciate that somebody was concerned about what was going on. That's something of an understatement, isn't it? So I've always contested that Dr. Evans offers himself up to the National Crime Agency by his own admission. He then is contacted through the National Crime Agency by the police. The precise details of that don't really matter. Whether or not Dr. Evans' account of that is accurate doesn't really matter. And then he travels to Cheshire Police Station to meet with Cheshire Police, having been contacted by the National Crime Agency. Now, as he says here, you'd have to be more than a little bit naive not to appreciate that somebody was concerned about what was going on. He has previously stated and previously claimed that I had no idea that a crime had been committed when I arrived at the police station, but in fact, here in court, he has admitted that of course he'd have to know that there was a suspicion that a crime had been committed, or else why is he going to the police station? So I wanted to get over that first part of this cross-examination before we go back and look and examine some of the comments that he's made. So we're going to do that now. So we've established a couple of things. Firstly, Dr. Evans has stated on several occasions during this cross-examination that he conducted a diagnosis of exclusion. Dr. Evans has also stated that certain diagnostic features of air embolism helped confirm his diagnosis and that he had actually made this diagnosis before he encountered them. So previously, speaking on Talk TV, Dr. Evans had given another wonderful, fluent account of how he managed to arise at this diagnosis. It's a matter of excluding the usual sort of collapse of babies. One could easily exclude those when, in addition to this, one also found, in addition to this, the only explanation was the injection of air into the circulation. Very convincing, I'm sure you'll agree. And then he also spoke to BBC Panorama on this matter, not in the most recent Panorama, in an earlier episode. And he said, so having crossed off all the likely things, you then have to look at unlikely and rare and unthinkable things like air embolism. I kept looking for alternative causes, and so, I kept going back. What else could it be? What else could it be? But I eventually came to a conclusion. No, this, it must be this. It must be air. So I'm sure all the doctors that are watching this video are cringing at these words, but we're going to go into examining this a bit deeper. One of the things that I've written in my book is that one might reasonably ask Dr. Evans how he crossed off all of the conclusions that pathologists had drawn previously, all of the evidence of infection, and everything we know about poor care at the hospital. There seems to be absolutely no indication that he ever excluded any of these things, except that none of these things would result in Lucy Letby being guilty. Another thing we know, because Dr. Evans said this literally on the same day later in his cross-examination, is the following. Now, we're not actually going to get to this part of the cross-examination today because this is much later on, but we may discuss this at some point in the future. So Dr. Evans has said regarding child A, he suddenly crashes. What on earth is going on here? We've since heard about the discoloration, but before I knew about that, I thought if this baby has collapsed as promptly as that, and even more significantly, resuscitation was unsuccessful, that is an air embolus. That is an air embolus in my opinion, and that was my opinion before I knew about the x-rays and the discoloration. So with regard to those comments, in order to diagnose air embolism across multiple cases, Dr. Evans doesn't require any x-rays, any evidence of air being present, although even if air was present this can be accidental, or any evidence of discoloration or rashes. He has stated, and he indicated this earlier in the section we've already examined, but then he reiterates it later on the same day, that all he required was, there was a sudden collapse, there was no resuscitation. It's an air embolism. So I've written in my book, Dr. Evans is able to diagnose air embolus purely because the baby has collapsed as promptly as that and resuscitation was unsuccessful. That is literally what he's using as diagnostic criteria for air embolism. The baby collapsed, it wasn't successfully resuscitated, it's an air embolism, obviously. So we're going to examine this in greater depth using some further research. So this isn't the perfect way of demonstrating this, but it's a quick and illustrative way of showing how ridiculous what Dr. Evans claimed to have done actually is. So I simply asked this question of, if a neonate collapses and fails to respond to resuscitation, how many possible explanations could there be for this clinical picture? Then there was a bit of discussion between me and the AI platform, and after giving it 5 minutes to have some thought, it came to this conclusion. So firstly, there can be infectious causes, such as sepsis. So we saw sepsis in these infants being ruled out. There's necrotizing enterocolitis, that's something else we saw being ruled out. Of course, there are other possible infectious causes as well. Then we have cardiac causes. Various cardiac causes are possible. Then there's respiratory causes. There are various respiratory causes possible. I'm not going to read through all of this. Then there's metabolic and endocrine causes. There are various there, including we've seen one of the infants being hypoglycemic. There's other evidence of hypoglycemia in other infants as well. Then there's neurological causes. We see some of these appearing at some stages. Hematological causes. There's congenital anomalies, trauma and iatrogenic causes, etc., etc., and so it goes on. But I just want to show you that thrombosis is specifically mentioned here, intracranial hemorrhage, synovenous thrombosis, alloimmune thrombocytopenia, coagulopathy, possibly, thrombocytopenia or haemophilia, polycythemia can cause thrombosis. So I'm just highlighting this because the panel came to the conclusion that child A died due to thrombosis. Of course, there are other possible conclusions as well. And then I've gone on to ask here, could you give me a number of possible conditions for each of the 7 categories listed? And we see numerous categories listed all the way down here. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is just a quick reckoning of a number of possible causes that can't be ruled out, as certainly not as easily as Dr. Evans suggests. I've just decided this is an air embolism. Why? Because the child couldn't be resuscitated and it collapsed suddenly. Well, that's great, but there's literally like 7 or 8 other categories other than air embolism. Air embolism is barely even mentioned here. But so I've asked the question of, could a thrombosis be a possible cause of the clinical picture described above? Yes. Thrombosis can absolutely cause neonatal collapse that does not respond to resuscitation. In neonates, thrombosis is uncommon but well recognised, especially in critically ill or catheterised babies. And then so it goes on. So then I have said, would it be possible to distinguish between thrombosis and air embolism purely on the basis that an infant did not respond to resuscitation and collapsed suddenly, or would both remain possible? Purely from the clinical picture of sudden collapse with failure to respond to resuscitation, you cannot reliably distinguish between thrombosis and air embolism. Here's why. There's similarities between the two, there are some potential clues, there's definitive differentiation required. Conclusion, on the basis of sudden neonatal collapse and no response to resuscitation alone, both thrombosis and air embolism remain possible, and you can't definitively distinguish between them without additional context, line event, risk factors, or imaging. So what Dr. Evans actually used as his diagnostic factors were rashes and discoloration. We know that because they're central to the court case, they're central to the Court of Appeal verdict as well. So we also know now that the Lee and Tanswell paper that is mentioned earlier in this discussion, that Dr. Evans has made crystal clear, explicitly clear, that the Court of Appeal has made explicitly clear, that was his sole diagnostic source for using the only diagnostic criterion that has any merit whatsoever, which is the rashes and discoloration. We know fundamentally that is simply wrong. So at this point, we know that his diagnosis has no value whatsoever, because he said, I made this diagnosis based on these 2 factors for which there are literally dozens of other things that it could have been. And there's no way that he can rule out the very much more nuanced clinical picture that is described in the panel report. He simply hasn't done the work to do that. The only way that he could do that would be by using these rashes and discoloration. And as we know, those have been misused. We know that because the only diagnostic source that he used, the author of that source has said, well, you're completely wrong and you've misused it. So the next thing we've established is that Dr. Evans has stated that there should never be a hurried decision made with regard to any diagnosis with serious consequences. Of course, in the case of Lucy Letby, these have the most serious consequences for the defendant. But of course, Dr. Evans himself has stated that this is precisely what he did within a matter of minutes, and he never shifted from that position. He decided that the case of child O was inflicted harm, and then changed his position on how this inflicted harm occurred, while always retaining the conviction that it was inflicted harm. We've also learned that Dr. Evans has always maintained that he has no idea that a crime had been committed. When he travelled down to that police station, there was no prospect that he could possibly know that a crime had been committed. But in court, he has conceded that he'd have to be pretty stupid not to know that something criminal was suspected. Of course, otherwise, why is he reading about in The Guardian in the first place, with the police being quoted, if indeed he did do this because he's already changed his story more than once? Why is he contacting the police through the National Crime Agency? Why is he driving what is at least a 7-hour round trip to Blacon Police Station? And why is he meeting with Cheshire Police? One would have to not unreasonably conclude that it's quite likely that there are serious suspicions that a crime has been committed under these circumstances. In fact, it's blindingly obvious that he's driving there because there are strong suspicions of a crime having been committed. He then decides within a few minutes, we've got this down to less than 10 minutes now. It's probably just a few minutes. Elsewhere he said immediately that there is definitely inflicted harm, and so he has confirmed that the crime that he had no idea had occurred has definitely happened, and he has done this almost immediately, even though in court he has claimed that you should never jump to such conclusions. So then I've asked this simple question about, could you list as many possible causes as possible of bleeding in the liver region? So there's traumatic causes, there's 3 listed: blunt abdominal trauma, penetrating trauma, iatrogenic injury, then hepatic pathology, primary liver tumours, metastatic tumours, liver abscess rupture, then vascular abnormalities such as ruptured hepatic artery aneurysm, ruptured portal vein aneurysm, arteriovenous malformations, hepatic vein inferior vena cava pathology, then 4 systemic and hematologic conditions, coagulopathies, thrombocytopenia, anticoagulant therapy, antiplatelet therapy, disseminated intravascular coagulation, severe liver failure, cirrhosis, infections and inflammation such as severe viral hepatitis, parasitic infections, liver abscess rupture. The 6th area would be pregnancy-related causes. Obviously, this is very unlikely. Iatrogenic procedure-related, post-liver biopsy bleeding, post-percutaneous transhepatic colonography or drainage, post-radiofrequency ablation or microwave ablation, post-transjugular intrahepatic portosystemic shunt procedure. Other rare causes: amyloidosis with vessel fragility, copper ion overload, severe sepsis with liver necrosis and bleeding. Of course, we know that's present in other cases. Idiopathic spontaneous rupture. In clinical practice, the most common causes are trauma, hepatocellular carcinoma, hepatic adenoma, and pregnancy-related conditions. So then I've just asked a very simple question: could a medical error also lead to a liver injury and blood being drawn, for example, with a needle? Yes, absolutely. A medical error or complication can cause liver injury or bleeding. Then it's given a few liver needle-related causes: liver biopsy, central venous catheter insertion. We know there's been problems with them in the course. And then here, paracentesis. And we know this is the procedure. Notice, I didn't prompt the artificial intelligence to produce this. It just produced it like that. There's many others as well. Now, of course, and it goes on to give some other possibilities. Now, of course, we know that it's reasonable that some of these things can be ruled out quite quickly, almost immediately by a doctor. There's no way they can rule out all of these things, and I'm damn certain he can't rule this out because there's very strong evidence to suggest this has occurred. I would say overwhelming evidence. So when Dr. Evans walked in there and in 2 minutes said, "Oh, this is definitely inflicted injury," of course, he didn't know that a crime had been committed, although, according to his own words, he'd have to be naive not to know that there were suspicions as he drove to the police station representing the National Crime Agency. And he ruled out all these things immediately. He just immediately knew, oh yeah, there's definitely been a crime here. I will leave people to ponder and reflect on this. So we'll rejoin the cross-examination of Dr. Evans here. There's about 7 or 8 pages to go with some important stuff that I want to go over. In the previous section, he's just made this comment about you'd have to be naive to think that a crime hadn't been committed, which we just discussed. And also he's been making these comments about, obviously you can have an unascertained death, even though in another interview he said, there should never be an unascertained death. And he's talking about how pathologists and coroners will often list a death as unascertained, which is something the police have failed to understand as we've established in previous videos. But this is just something that was thrown out of this court case completely. Dr. Evans was able to overrule the pathologist and coroner, and the court never really heard much about this, although at least there was some discussion of it. But Dr. Evans said, I can categorically say what happened in each of these cases. So we'll continue with this cross-examination at this point. And so they didn't tell me, this is the police or the National Crime Agency, anything about what happened. All I was told was, and I think this was in the papers actually, all I was told was there's a hospital in Chester where lots of babies have died, and this is a hospital where 3 or 4 babies die per year, which is, about the average for a baby unit of that size, but somehow or other, over a very short period of time, they'd had far more deaths, which is a worry. So that's untrue, because if Dr. Evans read the Guardian report, which he claims to have read, then there is a direct quotation from Nigel Wenham of Cheshire Police indicating that the police were investigating. So it's interesting that he's only revealed this now, although I doubt that he remembers that he said this in court, because he's contradicted himself so many times by now, you could just write a book about all of his contradictions. But it's not true to say there was just a report in the newspaper, in the Guardian, that he claimed that he read the Guardian report. Of course, he claimed that he read it elsewhere on other occasions, but let's just assume for the sake of argument he's told the truth and given an accurate version of events in Panorama that he's spoken in most recently. According to what he said there, he read about this in the Guardian, it is categorically untrue to state that report just said, there's been a few deaths. That's not what the report said, because there wouldn't be a newspaper report if that was the case. Because every time there's a few deaths in a hospital, it doesn't get fed to a newspaper, because that happens all the time. The only reason it was in the newspaper was because the police had fed it to the newspaper, and the police, of course, were directly quoting the article. So what he said there is it's either, if you're going to be really generous, you could say he's forgotten what was written in the article, which seems very unlikely, or it's a deliberate misrepresentation. I'm not sure which one of those two will play. And several of the babies who had collapsed, resuscitation was unsuccessful, which is even more of a worry. So therefore we had a constellation of worries here, and so the medical team got the police in. So that is how it is. And by the way, so when I went to see them, I said, look, just give me the clinical notes of all the babies within this window, this 12-month period. Give me the notes for all the babies who have died, all the babies who have collapsed, not died, notes of any baby, where something has happened where you can't explain it. So first of all, he's saying, give me the notes of the babies who've died. Then he said, no, actually the babies who've collapsed. Just anything where something has happened, obviously. I'm not going to jump to any conclusions. Nothing could be further from the truth, obviously. And then also note that he's saying, give me the clinical notes and I'll look over them. He hasn't mentioned the fact that he walked in there and said immediately, this is inflicted harm, definitely. So it had nothing to do with investigating a crime. It was investigating a clinical condition. It's quite important, actually. It's different. All of my reports are based on investigating a clinical condition. My reports are clinical conditions. I'm not there investigating crimes. The police do that. I'm there because of my medical expertise to see if I can assist in forming an opinion regarding what's gone on. And I've done a number of reports where things were suspicious for police authorities elsewhere, where it was obvious to me that some child had sustained some kind of unusual accident, but it was an accident, and therefore the police were able to close the file, and that was that. So what I would have done, if I was the defence barrister at this point, is I would have interrupted immediately. Now, I think Ben Myers allowed him to talk for far too long here, and I don't know what the hell he was doing, although I think what he was possibly trying to do was lead Dr. Evans into saying certain things and then discredit him. But I still would have interrupted here and say, can you give me the example of when you intervened in something and then gave an opinion that resulted in you not getting work and money? Because we haven't found too many of those in the cases that we have on file. I mean, for example, there was this case that's overturned in Northern Ireland where he said, the parents have definitely engaged in malicious behaviour against their infant, then it was overturned on appeal and Dr. Evans' evidence was criticised. Not for the first time in his glittering glittering court career. So he goes on here, so that happens as well. So it isn't that if I'm involved, we're going to end up with somebody being charged with a serious offence. That's true, Dr. Evans, because as you like to remind us, you also act for the defence. But how often are you given the opportunity to participate in a court case and it doesn't go to court and you don't perform professional duties in relation to that case? That would be something that I'd like to know. Have you really walked into a police station and said, well, I could say this is inflicted harm, or I could say something that will result in me being in the case, but I'm not going to do that, I'm going to say the opposite? Because in this case, you walked in there in 2 minutes in a situation where you'd have to be naive, as you put it, not to know that a crime had been committed, and then you immediately said, oh, well, there's definitely been inflicted harm. So that's something of a coincidence, isn't it, Dr. Evans? So in this particular case, that's where we started from. The disadvantage that the Cheshire Police had, and I had at the beginning, was that, these babies had just collapsed and we had no idea why. Although I did immediately tell them there was inflicted harm, of course. What I told them, and I think this is quite important from a diagnostic point of view, I said, look, if a baby collapses, something has happened. It might be the end result of an infection. It might be the end result of, a brain hemorrhage. It might be the end result of a collapsed lung. There are all sorts of reasons why babies collapse. That's an entirely reasonable series of statements. Absolutely. But if I can get all the reports, I will work out a timeline for you. That's the way I did all of these reports. That's the way I do all the reports I do. It's just unfortunate that in this case, he concluded that every single collapse that's in the court case was due to malignant harm by Lucy Letby using these variety of arcane and unlikely methods. He also concluded that in case after case after case, this was due to the injection of air or air embolism, even though the way that he diagnosed this is utterly ridiculous. I'll work out a timeline for you. Right, this baby was well up until a particular time, and then suddenly he crashes. Now, on the whole, babies don't do that. They don't suddenly crash. And on the occasion that they do, they deteriorate quickly. As we have heard already, you can resuscitate them quite easily. As I said, this is contradicted in some of the cases in the court case. So therefore, what I said was, look, I'll go through all these notes for you and I'll identify every point where a baby has deteriorated, okay? That's the first thing I did. The second thing I did, I said, right, let's see why these babies collapsed. Now, we will deal with this in another cases in this trial. There were a number of deteriorations where it was obvious why a baby had deteriorated. There was evidence of infection, evidence of a blocked tube, a collapsed lung, maybe pneumothorax. So there was evidence of infection in the infants that were in the court case, Dr. Evans. You just excluded that, or you denied that it was the case, or you diminished the significance of it. Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Evans. May I just interrupt to ask, are you saying this is everything you've been told when this began? No, this is what I did. This is what I did. If you just pause, I don't mean to be rude, but the question I asked was your state of mind, asking about what you thought when you were first approached by the NCA. No, my state of mind was very clear, which I think is why I'm still in demand as an independent medical witness, not that I'm blowing my own trumpet, of course. My state of mind was very clear. Let's find out the diagnosis. Let's find out what on earth is going on. Nothing to do with, crimes or anything of that nature. But you said that you'd have to be naive not to believe that a crime had been committed, essentially. Let's find out what's going on. Let's identify any specific collapse. Let's see if I can explain all of this. And there were occasions when I could explain it, and there were occasions when there was something that I found deeply suspicious. And we will, if we are speaking generally, Mr. Myers, there were incidents that I found disturbing. I don't want to talk about that today because that's for other cases. So therefore, when I investigate a case, when doctors investigate a case, you are only talking about one case. So in my initial scrutiny, that is obviously didn't cover everything. In my initial scrutiny, I looked at 28 cases, 28, and then they were followed by another 5. So with a 33 in all, and then the 2 insulin ones came later. So therefore, I looked at loads of cases. In certain cases, the reason why the little baby had died was very obvious. I recall there was one case where the baby was born severely asphyxiated, severe brain damage from birth, unsurvivable. There were other babies who had significant congenital malformations incompatible with life. So I wouldn't necessarily disagree with this. I'm sure doctors, medics and scientists wouldn't necessarily disagree with this. But the point is that there are clinical explanations that vastly differ from those that were put into the court case by Dr. Evans, for which I believe he just simply hasn't sought sufficient evidence, but certainly he has discounted these clinical explanations with insufficient evidence. I don't want to take you away from the topic, Dr. Evans. Yes, but that's the way clinicians approach things, okay? So it's quite important, I think, for members of the jury to appreciate that I was not investigating a suspect who was an individual who was suspected of inflicting harm on a baby. So again, we've seen previously that Dr. Evans will volunteer this information, place this strange emphasis on the idea that he wasn't investigating a subject, and then he goes on to say, I was not doing that at all because for the obvious reason, I was unaware of any suspect. The name Lucy Letby meant nothing to me. I didn't know any of these people. So he's always keen to emphasise that. Very, very strange that he's so keen to emphasise, I didn't know the name Lucy Letby. I wasn't investigating a suspect. Nothing could be further from the truth. And we've seen in previous videos that I've made, one in particular, that we know for a fact, definitively, beyond any doubt whatsoever, it's undeniable that Dr. Evans knew the name of Lucy Letby during his investigation, and he amended reports and filed new reports well after the point that he knew Lucy Letby's name. Indeed, he made changes during the court case. So the idea that the name Lucy Letby meant nothing to him, stuff that is in the court case, we don't know how much, but we know a significant amount. Stuff that is in the court case was produced by Dr. Evans when he definitely knew the name Lucy Letby and definitely knew that Lucy Letby was a suspect and even knew that Lucy Letby had been arrested. So why he's volunteering this information as if he's got a guilty conscience, again, I will leave viewers to conclude for themselves. So now we're going to hear some interesting stuff about air embolus. Air embolus had never crossed the radar of anybody in Chester as far as I knew. The other events that we've spoken about, none of that was remotely run past me. So again, why are you suddenly volunteering this information? Why are you telling us, oh, no one had ever said anything about embolus? As far as I know, the other events that we've spoken about, no one told me about any of that. I didn't have any idea. Why are you? You haven't been asked about this. This isn't a direct answer to a direct question. Why are you telling us this? So we're going to reflect on this at the end of the video, but I want to get through this part of the cross-examination first. I was on the easiest position and the most difficult. Easiest in that I had a blank sheet. What on earth is going on here, Dr. Evans? That's for you. Helping the police with their inquiries, if you like, Mr. Myers. I had no idea, we had no idea, and therefore I relied entirely on the evidence I could see from the clinical notes and applying my clinical experience to form an opinion as to the cause. So that is, that's how I did it. As I say, notice this is this stilted, stuttering delivery. Now we'll see this numerous times, but I will get to the end of the cross-examination before we discuss that further. Can I just ask you to answer this? I don't mean to be rude, but as directly as you can, Dr. Evans, is there any possibility that you might have allowed the suspicion of harm when you were asked to look at these to have led you to look for possible mechanisms in some cases? No, I wasn't looking for harm, I was looking for a cause. For example, when you were told the babies were stable and just collapsed, was that your starting point? No. Did you have telephone conversations with the officers of the NCA? No. None? As far as these babies are concerned, it was having a chat with my contact at the NCA, let's go to Chester. So I spoke to her and said, we don't know what is going on. Basically, nobody knew what was going on as far as I could tell. So he also says, as far as I could tell, nobody knew what was going on. Yeah, no one had any idea. Then I was the first person who came in. I haven't heard any suspicions from anyone else. So I said, look, I can't tell what is going on. What I suggest is this. This is before I, if you like, accepted the instruction to do anything for Cheshire Police. What happened was they got in touch with the NCA and I got in touch and Cheshire Police rung me, I think, and I said, look, I'll come up and see you, so I'll come up and see you. Notice this stilted, stuttering speech again here. So I drove up from Carmarthen, where I live, on a sunny day in July and said, look, I'll come and see you, I'll come and talk to you. I don't know whether I'm of any use to you. All I want you to do, bring me a case, bring one case file, just to give me a sort of idea what's going on here. So as I was saying to someone in the comments today, I question this version of events. Because we now know from Stephanie, we have a full timeline. I'll actually just put the full timeline on the screen now so we can consider whether or not it's likely that he drove down in July or not, given that he's changed virtually every other aspect of every account of everything that he said about everything. So we have this timeline here that's been established now that I've spoken to Stephanie. So on the 2nd of May, the Council of Chester Hospital writes to Cheshire Police asking them to exclude unnatural causes. On the 5th of May, the initial meeting with Operation Hummingbird concludes that there is no evidence other than coincidence pointing to any malignant behaviour. On the 8th of May, Stephanie Davies concludes her 3-hour review, indicating that there is no evidence of malfeasance, but there are missing jigsaw pieces in some cases. On the 12th of May, a meeting between various personnel from the Cheshire Constabulary and 3 executives from the Council of Chester concludes with an agreement that there is no basis for a police investigation and no intention of conducting one. On the 15th of May, Dr Stephen Breary and Dr Ravi Jairam meet with Cheshire Police and provide them with information of varying degrees of accuracy, much of it completely inaccurate. They also strongly point to their suspicions regarding a nurse and essentially identify Lucy Letby. On the 18th of May, Cheshire Police have suddenly made a rapid about-face indicating their intention to The Guardian of launching an investigation. According to this latest version of events, this is when Dr Evans learns about the case for the first time. So you see how quickly, within less than a week, within a matter of days, they've gone from there's going to be no investigation, there's no evidence, there's no reason for investigation to we're definitely having an investigation. Not only are we definitely having an investigation, we're going to announce this to The Guardian. So according to Dr Evans, he drove down in July. I would question whether or not this is accurate. It seems to me that it's pretty odd that it took 2 months from this point, given how quick they were to make this decision, and given that he supposedly read about this on the 18th of May. Now, it's possible there could be bureaucracy, it's possible that there could have been delays, and that can't be ruled out entirely, and I'm not claiming to know that he definitely didn't travel down in July, but it wouldn't surprise me at all, he's either given numerous inaccurate accounts, or he's got a terrible memory, or both. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if he actually drove down in May, and this was all concluded in May, and that within a matter of days we had Dr Evans in the police station saying, oh look, this looks like inflicted harm. We can't say that for certain, but I'm sceptical about his claims that he drove down in July. So I drove up from Carmarthen, where I live, on a sunny day in July, supposedly, and said, look, I'll come and see you, I'll come and talk to you, I don't know whether I'm of any use to you, all I want you to do, bring me a case, bring one case file, just to give me a sort of idea of what's going on here. During the course of any discussion before you read the reports on baby A or baby B, was the expression air embolus used at any point? No, not at all. The first person who thought about air embolus in this particular case, as far as I know, was me. Well, we know that we have already heard from Dr Jairam that the doctors at the hospital had already, it seemed one or more had turned their mind to that at some point during that period. We know that, don't we? Do we? You listened to the evidence yesterday? Yes, but that was afterwards. So we're going to assess this after this cross-examination, bear in mind. No, during the period after baby D, I asked Dr Jairam about it. I can't remember that. Well, if you can't remember, that's how the paper was raised with him. Do you remember that yesterday, going to the paper? Do you remember going to the research paper with Dr Jairam? I remember that, yes. And my questions to him about going to look at this after the death of baby D in June 2015 and how he and his colleagues were talking about this pulmonary vascular embolism. But I knew nothing about any of this. So when you had your chat with your contact at the NCA, did they not say at this point the doctors think there maybe involves their embolisms? Did they not give you that much of a steer? Not. They didn't give me any steer at all. And I need to compliment the NCA. They never give you a steer. They just tell you, look, you deal with the police. They are very good, straight people. You do recall me asking Dr Jairam yesterday, just so you're not at any disadvantage about the paper he went to look at. I can't remember the date. Yes, I heard that. Yes, I think... Oh, so a minute ago, you didn't think you did hear it. Yes, I think there was far too much emotion in that, by the way, but I was only listening next door. Like, what difference does that make? But I think what Dr Jairam said was all of this followed. I mean, I can't remember whether he said it was in 2017 or 2018 or whatever. I read about, this morning Mr Johnson mentioned my second report where I quoted Dr Jairam's observations regarding the flitting abnormalities and things, if I could help. Notice again these stilted, stuttering responses. Could I put it this way, Dr Evans? I have asked you whether there was any conversation when you were approached by the NCA about air embolism and you say no. I can't remember any. About air embolus, you say no. I can't remember any. Right. Okay, I have been involved in this case. This is the 6th year, so if I've overlooked something or other, that's you know, but I can't remember anything. But I think to help Mr. Myers here, I've got this, okay, just a minute, wrong one, wrong twin. So they move on to discuss behaviour at this point. So I'm going to wrap up the cross-examination at this point and just reflect on what we've just heard. So firstly, Dr. Evans is asked about whether he'd heard about air embolism previously. And again, he makes this strange comment that he often makes, essentially, oh, I was definitely the first person to mention air embolism as far as I know. So that's kind of giving him a get out, as if someone else could have mentioned it, but he obviously doesn't know anything about this. Then there is some discussion regarding Dr. Jairam. Now, as we know, Dr. Jairam explicitly mentioned air embolism in a meeting with Cheshire Police on the 15th of May. There's then some discussion with Dr. Evans claiming, oh well, I'm not sure exactly when this was mentioned. Was it after? Was it in 2018? Was it in 2017? I'm not really sure. I would suggest that Dr. Jairam mentioned it in 2018 doesn't even make any sense. Then Dr. Evans is oddly evasive regarding the testimony of Dr. Jairam, suggesting that he wasn't aware of it and that he'd never encountered this previously and that he didn't know Dr. Jairam had even mentioned air embolism. And then Ben Myers asks him, well, you were actually present in court, were you not listening to that? And then he sort of concedes, oh yeah, but I was next door so I didn't really hear it properly. So a very strange moment indeed, I would suggest. So we can see here on the screen, this is the account of the 15th of May meeting with Dr. Jairam and Dr. Brewery with Cheshire Police, where we see Ravi Jairam specifically mention air embolism as being a suspicion. So coincidentally, Dr. Jairam has mentioned air embolism explicitly previously, just 3 days before Dr. Evans learned about this case, and then coincidentally, Dr. Evans has settled on this as his primary diagnosis in the court case, despite the fact that he's never encountered it previously. And then, coincidentally, they've both used the same exact 30-year-old obscure paper that was barely even known about at the time in order to form this diagnosis. And coincidentally, Dr. Evans claims that he was the first person to ever think of this and had never encountered any previous suggestions of air embolism and didn't even know if it had been mentioned previously. And then, coincidentally, literally everyone else with medical qualifications who encounters this theory and the work that Dr. Evans has done considers it to be total crap. So I won't provide my own conclusion on this matter. I will just, again, leave viewers to consider what we know about this and what Dr. Evans has said in court about this. So finally, with regard to these stuttering, stilted, incoherent statements that we encounter from Dr. Evans, both in the court case and here on the screen, this was in a conversation with Talk TV. What I would say to you is that when I'm speaking in these podcasts, I very rarely scripted anything that I say. There are a few episodes that I scripted. For example, the Panorama 200 Things You Didn't Hear video, that was entirely scripted because I wanted to make it as good as possible. There's a couple of the other shorter ones where I'm trying to fit things into a short period of time that were scripted, and there are occasional segments in some of the videos that are scripted, but typically in these longer podcast episodes that I make, 95% of them are not scripted at all. And the simple reason for that is I can speak fluently on these subjects because I've researched them in depth and I know what I'm talking about. But also, crucially, I'm telling the truth, or at least I'm telling what I believe to be the truth. The truth is never difficult to remember. You don't stumble over the truth, you just recount it fluently. I'm sure when Dr. Michael McConville is doing his podcast series, I'm very confident that he doesn't script that very much and that he just speaks from his experience as a medical practitioner and speaks his version of the truth as well. I will leave people to reflect on why it is that we see so many stuttering and stilted statements from Dr. Evans. All I would say in conclusion of this video is that this court case hangs on the words of Dr. Evans. Now, in this video, we've assessed the key diagnosis that he made in this court case on the very first day that he appeared in court. I know that lots of doctors are following me now. Please indicate in the comments section if you can find any way to defend what Dr. Evans has done, or if you can find any way to defend what he describes as his diagnosis of exclusion. In another aspect of the trial, he claims to have done a differential diagnosis, which is equally ridiculous. But I would be amazed if there is any scientist, any doctor out there who will defend Dr. Evans who will say that this is a legitimate diagnosis, or indeed any nurse, any experienced nurse who will say the same thing. And I want people to know that if you believe Lucy Letby to be guilty, you are siding with Dr. Evans. In fact, you are reliant on Dr. Evans. And when he was cross-examined in this court case, it was an absolute train wreck for anyone with even the remotest medical and scientific understanding. This is only the first part of the first day. There's a lot more to come that we're going to look at in future videos. And that's leaving aside whether or not some of his claims are even true, but the comments that he made in this very first appearance in court frankly reek like rotten cheese. The sooner that this dangerous and deluded man is investigated and everything that he's done in previous court cases is properly examined, the safer we will all be.